I had quietly purchased the controlling rights to the well that supplied water to the entire neighborhood. All 198 households were looking at me like I was the villain as I locked the valve during a 109-degree heat wave in New Mexico. But it all started when the HOA brazenly buried a pipeline through my land, a land I was never asked about, never consulted on, and never compensated for. Now, as I sat on the wooden steps of my ranch house with a glass of mint iced tea sweating in my hand, I watched Diane Pritchard standing in front of my porch, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Please turn the water back on." Her iPad was clutched against her chest like a shield, and she couldn't seem to meet my eyes. I didn't say anything, just took another sip and waited for what would come next. Before I tell you how Diane nearly collapsed in the middle of that community meeting, let me know which state you're reading from, because trust me, what happened next will make you think this can't possibly be real. The air shimmered above the dirt road that separated my 80-acre ranch from the pristine Desert Springs Estates development. It was 7:34 in the evening, and the temperature still hadn't dropped below 108 degrees. Behind me, through the torn screen door, I could hear the rattle of my old ceiling fan struggling against the heat. In front of me stretched a neighborhood that hadn't existed 5 years ago. 198 stucco homes in soft beige and terracotta, red tile roofs, lawns that had already begun to turn yellow despite the drought restrictions everyone ignored. This was the New West, where planned communities sprouted like mushrooms after a rain, swallowing up ranch land that families like mine had worked for generations. Diane's white Lexus sat idling at the property line, driver's door still open. As if she'd been in such a hurry, she forgot to close it. She took 3 steps closer, her heels sinking slightly into the dust, and I could see her iPad clutched against her chest like a shield. "Jake," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "People are getting sick. Children are crying. You have to understand." I removed my sunglasses and met her eyes directly. "Diane, did the HOA ask me before they dug up my land?" The silence stretched between us like the desert itself. A dust devil spun lazily in the distance, crossing the empty lot where the HOA had planned to build their clubhouse. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "That was. We were going to send you the paperwork. It was just a formality." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 43 years in my knees. "A formality," I repeated. "That's what you called it 6 weeks ago when I found your crew digging a 4-foot trench through the western corner of my property." The memory came back sharp and clear, the sound of a backhoe at 6 in the morning, the smell of diesel exhaust, the foreman in his hard hat telling me with a shrug that the HOA had hired them and I should take it up with management. I had called Diane that same morning, standing in the middle of the torn-up earth while they laid 8-inch PVC pipe through soil my grandfather had once plowed. Her voice had been smooth as honey over the phone. "Jake, honey, that's just unused land on your property line. We need it for the community water infrastructure. You understand, right? We'll send over the easement paperwork next week." I had asked her directly if she had a permit, if she had legal authorization to cross private property. "We'll handle all that," she'd promised. "Don't worry about the details." But the details never came. No easement agreement. No compensation offer. No acknowledgement that they'd committed trespass on land that had been in my family since 1987. When I drove into town the following week to check the records at the Eddy County Clerk's office, the young woman behind the counter had searched for 15 minutes before telling me what I already suspected. There was no permit on file, no application for right-of-way, nothing. Now Diane stood in my dirt driveway with sweat running down her temples, her professional mask cracking under the pressure of 198 families without running water. "Jake, I'm asking you as a neighbor." I held up one hand. "You're not my neighbor." "Diane, you're the president of an HOA that decided my property rights didn't matter. Because you thought I was just some rancher who wouldn't know better." Her face went from red to white. "That's not. We didn't. But we both knew it was true. I'd seen the email. The one her former accountant had passed to me in a manila envelope at a coffee shop 3 days ago. The one where she'd written to the HOA's lawyer. He's just a rancher. He doesn't understand property law. Just do it. And if he complains, we'll drag out the process until he gives up." I turned and walked toward my front door, the screen protesting with a rusty squeal as I pulled it open. Diane called after me. "Jake, you can't do this." I paused in the doorway, half in shadow, and looked back at her. "You already did it to me," I said quietly. The porch light clicked off, triggered by its timer, and Diane was left standing alone in the gathering darkness of the desert evening. Through the screen, I could hear her heels scraping against the gravel as she turned back toward her car. The Lexus door slammed shut with an expensive thunk. The engine revved once, twice, and then the red taillights disappeared down the road toward the pristine neighborhood that was. At this very moment, discovering what it meant to live without running water in the middle of a New Mexico summer. The next morning, at 9 a.m., I drove my Ford F-250 into town. The county clerk's office waiting in a 2-story brick building with an American flag snapping above the entrance. Inside, the smell of old paper and toner cartridges hit me as I approached the wooden counter where a young woman in her 20s looked up from her computer screen. "I need to see the property records for my ranch," I said, "and also any construction permits filed by the Desert Springs Estates HOA for the past 6 months. She nodded and disappeared into a back room, returning 15 minutes later with a manila folder and a puzzled expression. "Mr. Mercer, your property records are all here, clear title dating back to 1987. But there's nothing from the HOA. No permits. The system held nothing, no permits. No easements. No requests." I pulled out my phone and began photographing each page, saving them to a folder I'd labeled HOA Evidence. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mercer," the voice said. Male, middle-aged, slightly nervous. "My name is Ben Carter. I used to work as the accountant for Desert Springs HOA. I quit last month because I couldn't stand the way Diane Pritchard operates. I have something you need. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, one of those generic chains where nobody paid attention to anyone else." Ben was waiting in a corner booth when I arrived, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a blue polo shirt. He slid a manila envelope across the table without ceremony. Inside were printouts of email exchanges, and my eyes locked onto one in particular. It was from Diane to the HOA's attorney, dated May 15th, 2024. "We need the pipeline to go through Mercer's land. He's just a rancher. Doesn't understand property law. Just do it. If he objects, we'll tie him up in procedures until he gives up." 3 other landowners folded when we did this to them. I read it twice, then looked up at Ben. "Why are you giving me this?" His jaw tightened. "Because Diane has been doing this for years, pushing people around, assuming they're too poor or too scared to fight back. But you're different, aren't you?" I folded the papers carefully and slid them into my jacket pocket. "Thank you, Ben." He ordered a grande latte. I ordered black coffee. He smiled faintly. "You don't like milk. I don't like paying $6 for something I can make at home for 50 cents, I said. The tension broke slightly, and Ben nodded toward the envelope. "Use it well." As I drove home, I kept thinking about water, about control, about leverage. New Mexico law was clear on one principle: whoever controls the water source controls the usage rights. The Desert Springs development relied entirely on a single deep well drilled 300 feet into the aquifer, managed by a private company called Western Aquifer Solutions. The HOA had a contract with them, but contracts could be transferred, bought out, or reassigned. I'd sold 20 head of cattle 3 months earlier for just over $60,000. Money I'd been saving for fence repairs and a new barn roof. Now it would serve a different purpose. I found Western Aquifer's number and called from my truck, the phone almost too hot to hold against my ear in the afternoon sun. A gravelly voice answered. Western Aquifer. Tom Bradley speaking. Mr. Bradley, my name is Jake Mercer. I'm calling about the well that services Desert Springs Estates. I understand the HOA has a contract with you. There was a pause. Yeah, we manage that well. What's your interest? I'm wondering if that contract might be available for purchase. Another pause. Longer this time. The HOA's got 18 months left on their agreement. But to be honest, they've been late on payments twice in the last 3 months. If someone wanted to buy out the contract and take over management, I'd consider it. How much? $47,000 for the remaining term, plus transfer of operational control. I'll give you $50,000 if you can transfer control of the main valve to me within 48 hours. Tom Bradley laughed, a dry sound like wind through sagebrush. Deal. Mr. Mercer, meet me at my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Bring a cashier's check. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of water, watching lights come on across the development, families settling in for another sweltering night, unaware that the source of every shower, every cold drink, every flush of a toilet was about to change hands. My phone buzzed with a text from Ben. Diane just called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. She's telling everyone you're trying to sabotage the community. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, good. Let them all be there when this comes to a head. In the distance, I heard the faint hiss of a sprinkler system starting up in the development, water arcing through the darkness. I thought about my grandfather, who used to say that in the desert, water is power. He just never imagined his grandson would use that power against a homeowners association. The stars were coming out above the desert, hard and bright and indifferent. 3 days later, I sat across from Tom Bradley in a cramped office that smelled of burnt coffee and dust. The air conditioning unit in the window rattled like it was trying to shake itself apart. Tom was 60-something with silver hair and a blue shirt. He pushed 3 documents across the desk, each one thick with legal language and county stamps. Assignment of water rights agreement, bill of sale for well infrastructure, and notice of termination to the HOA. I read each page slowly, my eyes catching on the key phrases. Transfer of operational control, exclusive management authority, immediate effect upon payment. Tom watched me with the patient expression of a man who'd seen plenty of land deals go sideways. You sure about this? Mr. Mercer, once you sign, you own the water supply for 198 houses. I looked up at him. The HOA dug through my land without permission. They thought I wouldn't fight back because I'm just a rancher. Tom nodded slowly. Diane Pritchard came by here last month, tried to renegotiate our rate down by 30%. Said we should be grateful for the contract. I told her we'd been in business 20 years before her development was even a sketch on paper. He tapped the documents with one thick finger. I'll be honest. It'll feel good to wash my hands of that woman. I pulled the cashier's check from my wallet. $50,000 drawn on Wells Fargo, and set it on the desk. There's one condition I need in writing. Tom raised an eyebrow. You file Form OSE 305 with the State Engineer Office within 48 hours. Change of ownership has to be registered with the state before the HOA can challenge it. Tom smiled for the first time. You know your water law. I used to practice civil law before I came back here to ranch. His smile widened into something like respect. We signed in front of a notary public, a tired-looking woman who worked in the office next door and charged $20 for her stamp. Tom initialed the line confirming he'd courier Form OSE 305 to the state engineer first thing in the morning, then slid the executed contracts into a folder with my name on it. When it was done, he handed me a key ring with 2 keys, main pump house and the valve control box. He stood and shook my hand, his grip dry and firm. Good luck, Mr. Mercer. You're going to need it. I walked out into the blinding sunlight and sat in my truck for a long moment, feeling the weight of those keys in my palm. Across town, Diane Pritchard had no idea that her water supply now belonged to the man she'd tried to steamroll. That evening, my phone rang. Diane's voice came through high and sharp, barely controlled panic underneath the words. "Jake, what did you do? Tom Bradley just called me. He said our contract is terminated. He said you bought the well. Are you insane?" I kept my voice level. "You dug through my land without permission. Diane. Now I bought the water source you're using. Seems fair to me." There was a long silence. Then her voice came back colder. "You'll regret this. I'll sue you. You'll be hearing from our attorney by morning. The community will hate you. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you are." I ended the call without responding and set the phone face down on the porch railing. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with notifications. I opened the community group online and watched the posts multiply. Diane had written a long message. "Urgent. A resident has purchased our water supply in an act of personal revenge. Our families could lose access to water at any moment. We must take action." The comments came fast. "Who does he think he is? We should sue him." One voice tried to push back. "Has anyone asked why he did this?" But it was drowned out. My neighbor Linda wrote, "I can't believe Jake would do something so cruel." I typed a response and let it sit in the text box for a full minute before posting. "Ask your HOA president if she got my permission before digging a pipeline through my private property. Ask if she filed any permits with the county. Ask if she paid me $1 for using my land. Then we can talk." I hit post and watched the comment appear. Within 5 seconds, it had 7 angry reactions. Within a minute, Diane had replied, "Jake Mercer is spreading lies to justify his vindictive actions." The HOA followed all proper procedures. I took a screenshot of her response, saved it to my evidence folder, and closed my phone. The house was quiet, except for the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of cicadas in the mesquite trees. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out toward the pump house, a small concrete building barely visible in the darkness about half a mile south. Inside that building was a valve, and that valve controlled everything. Tomorrow morning, I will drive out there with Tom's keys. Tomorrow I would turn that valve clockwise until it stopped. Tomorrow, Diane Pritchard and 198 households will learn what it felt like to have their assumptions overturned. I went to bed that night with the keys on my nightstand, and I slept better than I had in 6 weeks. I woke at 5:30 a.m. on the 18th of July, the sky still dark. By the time I reached the pump house 20 minutes later, driving across the hardpan in my truck with the keys heavy in my pocket, the first edge of sun was breaking over the Guadalupe Mountains to the east. The pump house was a squat concrete box about the size of a garden shed, painted beige to match the desert with a padlocked metal door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, machine oil and damp concrete and the faint metallic tang of the water itself. In the center of the small room stood the main valve, a wheel about the size of a dinner plate, painted red. Pipes ran in every direction like arteries. I put both hands on the wheel and began to turn it clockwise. The valve resisted at first, stiff from months of being left open, but then it gave way and turned smoothly. I counted the rotations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At 7 full turns, the wheel stopped, and I heard the change immediately. The hum of water pressure in the pipes dropped to a whisper, then to nothing. The silence was absolute. I stood there for 10 seconds, my hand still on the valve, and then I stepped back outside and locked the door behind me. The sun was fully up now, turning the sky from purple to copper. I drove home slowly, watching the development in my rearview mirror. Lights were coming on in windows. People were waking up. They would turn on their faucets for morning coffee, for showers, for washing their faces, and nothing would come out. By 7:15 a.m., my phone started ringing. I didn't answer. By 8 a.m., I had 12 missed calls and 23 text messages. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize. but a few were from people I knew. Linda from 3 houses down the road. Carl, the retired teacher who sometimes waved when I drove past. A woman named Patricia who'd once bought eggs from me. The messages ranged from confused to angry to desperate. "Jake, what's happening? Did you really shut off our water? My daughter needs to get ready for work. Please call me." I set the phone on the kitchen counter and made myself breakfast. Scrambled eggs and toast, using water from my own well. Through the window, I could see a small crowd gathering at the property line, some on phones, others just staring toward my house. At 9 a.m., a sheriff's vehicle pulled up my driveway, dust rising behind it. Deputy Tom Hayes stepped out, a man in his 40s with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses. He walked up to my porch where I was sitting with a cup of coffee. "Mr. Mercer," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "We've had 27 calls this morning about the water being shut off. People are saying you're responsible." "I am," I said. Deputy Hayes took off his sunglasses and studied me. "You own the well." I stood up and went inside, returning a moment later with the folder Tom Bradley had given me. I handed it to the deputy. "Contract of sale, assignment of water rights, filed with the state engineer's office yesterday morning." "It's all legal," Hayes read through the papers slowly, his expression unchanging. "This is legal," he said finally. "But you understand, people are angry. Some are talking about coming over here." "I understand," I said. "But the HOA dug through my land without permission, without permits, without compensation. I tried to resolve it the right way. They ignored me. So I bought the source." Hayes handed the folder back to me and put his sunglasses back on. "I can't make you turn the water back on if you own it legally. But I'd suggest you be careful. Emotions are running high." He drove away slowly. I looked back toward the development. The crowd at the property line had grown. I counted maybe 30 people, some holding water bottles, some with their arms crossed. A few were taking photos with their phones. I stayed on my porch, visible but distant, and waited. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 106 degrees. I could see people moving between houses, carrying jugs and containers. Someone had set up a table and was handing out bottled water, probably from someone's emergency supply. My phone buzzed with a text from Ben. "Diane just called an emergency community meeting for tonight at 7 p.m. She's telling people you've endangered children and elderly residents. She wants everyone there." I texted back, "Good. Let them come. I want witnesses. I want them all to hear what I have to say." Ben sent back a single word: "Careful." I set the phone down and looked out at the shimmering heat. Somewhere, children cried and kitchens fell silent. I felt the weight of it, the responsibility, the anger that would come. But I also felt something else. The certainty that I was right, that property rights mattered, that you couldn't just take what you wanted because you had power and assumed no one would stop you. Monday morning arrived with a certified letter wedged in my screen door. The return address belonged to Martinez and Associates, a law firm in Carlsbad. I opened it standing on my porch, reading the formal language that boiled down to a simple threat. The Desert Springs Estates Homeowners Association was filing a civil lawsuit against me for interfering with access to a public utility and causing intentional distress to the community. They demanded I restore water service immediately or face damages exceeding $100,000. The letter was signed by Robert Martinez, attorney at law. In confident blue ink, I folded it carefully, went inside, and opened my laptop. It had been 9 years since I'd practiced law, but muscle memory came back fast. I pulled up the New Mexico statutes on water rights and property trespass. Then I started writing. My email to Martinez was brief and precise. I attached 3 documents. First, the county property records showing clear title to my land dating back to 1987, with no easement agreements on file. Second, the email from Diane to the HOA's attorney that Ben had given me, the one where she admitted they knew it was private property but planned to do it anyway. Third, an audio file, 6 weeks ago, when Diane had called me about the pipeline. I'd recorded the conversation on my phone, New Mexico was a one-party consent state, which meant I only needed my own permission to record. Her voice came through clearly on the recording. "That's just unused land on your property line. Jake, honey, we need it for the community. Don't worry about the details. We'll handle the paperwork later." I'd asked her directly if she had permits. "We'll get to that," she'd said. "Just let us finish the work." At the bottom of the email, I wrote a single paragraph. "Mr. Martinez, I am Jake Mercer, Juris Doctor from the University of New Mexico, School of Law, class of 2007. I stopped practicing in 2015 to return to my family's ranch, but I remain well-versed in New Mexico property and water law. If the HOA wishes to proceed with litigation, I am prepared to countersue for trespass, theft of easement rights, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I would advise your client to consider the risks before moving forward." I hovered my cursor over the send button for a full minute, then clicked. The email disappeared into the digital void. I made coffee and waited. 2 hours later, my phone rang. "Mr. Mercer, this is Robert Martinez. I just received your email. I wasn't aware you had a legal background." "Most ranchers don't," I said. He cleared his throat. "These documents, are you certain of their authenticity? I got them from a former HOA employee who kept copies before he quit." "Everything is verified and dated." There was a long pause. "Mr. Mercer, perhaps we can discuss this reasonably. I'm sure my client would be willing to negotiate a settlement if you restore the water. Your client can negotiate by publicly acknowledging they violated my property rights, paying fair compensation for the easement they took without permission, and agreeing in writing to never do this again. Until then, the water stays off." Martinez's voice shifted, became more formal. "I'll need to discuss this with Mrs. Pritchard, but I should warn you, the community is very upset. There's a meeting tonight, and feelings are running high." "I know about the meeting," I said. "I'll be there." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. "Mr. Mercer, I would strongly advise against attending in person, for your own safety." "I appreciate the concern," I said, and ended the call. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. I printed copies of every document, property records, emails, the sales contract for the well, the recording transcript. I put them in a leather folder my father had given me when I graduated from law school, the edges worn soft from years of use. On the front, in faded gold letters, it read, "Justice is not given. It is claimed." At 5 p.m., I called the New Mexico State Engineer's office and spoke with a woman named Ellen Rodriguez. I explained the situation, the unauthorized pipeline, the HOA's refusal to acknowledge property rights, and my purchase of the water source. She listened without interrupting, then asked me to email her everything I had. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "if what you're telling me is accurate, the HOA has violated state water use regulations. We'll open an investigation." "How long will that take?" I asked. She hesitated. "These things move slowly. Weeks, maybe months. But if you have solid evidence, we can expedite." I thanked her and hung up. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In 3 hours, I would walk into a room full of angry people who thought I was the villain. They would shout, they would accuse, and then I would show them exactly who had broken the law. The community center parking lot was full by the time I arrived at 6:50 p.m. Cars lined both sides of the street, and I could see people streaming toward the building, families with children, elderly couples moving slowly. I parked my truck at the far end and sat for a moment, watching. Through the large windows, I could see the main hall filling up, rows of folding chairs packed tight, people standing along the walls. I grabbed my leather folder and stepped out into the evening air, still hovering near 100 degrees. As I walked toward the entrance, conversations stopped, heads turned. I kept walking. Inside, the air conditioning was losing the battle against 200 bodies packed into a space meant for 150. The air smelled like sweat and anger and cheap coffee from the table near the back. I found an empty chair in the last row and sat down, placing my folder on my lap. On the stage, at the front, Diane Pritchard stood behind a podium with a microphone, shuffling papers with hands that wouldn't stay still. She wore a white blazer and kept tugging at the collar. She hadn't seen me yet. The crowd murmured and shifted. Babies crying, people fanning themselves with HOA newsletters. At exactly 7 p.m., Diane tapped the microphone. The feedback screech cut through the noise, and everyone fell silent. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice amplified and tight. "I know many of you are frustrated, and you have every right to be, but let me be clear about what's happening here. Jake Mercer purchased our water supply and shut it off because of what he calls a property dispute. Yes, there were delays in getting him the easement paperwork. That's normal in community development. What's not normal is punishing 198 families, including elderly residents and young children, over a technicality. We followed standard procedures. Mr. Mercer is twisting the facts to justify a personal vendetta." The crowd erupted. Someone shouted, "Where is he?" Diane held up her hand for quiet. "I've consulted with our attorney, and we are prepared to file a lawsuit. But first, I want to give Mr. Mercer one more chance to do the right thing. If he's here, I invite him to come forward and explain himself." I stood up. The room went silent again, this time deeper, heavier. Every head turned. Diane's eyes found me in the back row, and I saw her face change, the confident mask slipping for just a second. I walked down the center aisle, my boots loud on the tile floor. People leaned away as I passed. When I reached the stage, Diane stepped back from the microphone. I set my folder on the podium and opened it. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm and clear. "My name is Jake Mercer. And yes, I shut off the water. But before you decide I'm the villain here, I need you to understand why." I pulled out the first document. 6 weeks ago, the HOA dug a trench 4 feet deep through the western corner of my property and installed a pipeline without my permission. I held up the county property records. I own that land. It's been in my family since 1987. The HOA never filed for an easement, never asked for permission, never offered compensation. When I called Mrs. Pritchard, she told me not to worry, that she'd send paperwork later. The paperwork never came. I pulled out the email Ben had given me and held it up so the front rows could see. This is an internal email from Diane Pritchard to the HOA's attorney. In it, she writes, and I quote, "He's just a rancher, doesn't understand property law. Just do it. If he objects, we'll tie him up in procedures until he gives up." The room stirred. I saw people looking at each other, confusion replacing some of the anger. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the speaker system. I also have a recording of that same call with Mrs. Pritchard. New Mexico is a one-party consent state, which means this recording is completely legal. I pressed play. Diane's voice filled the room. Tinny, but clear. "That's just unused land. Jake Honey. We need it for the community. Don't worry about the details." My own voice. "Asking about permits. We'll handle all that. Don't worry." The recording ended, and I looked up. I didn't buy the water supply to hurt anyone. I bought it because it was the only way to make the HOA acknowledge what they did. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for what's legally mine. Fair compensation, a public apology, and a guarantee this won't happen to anyone else. Diane pushed forward, grabbing the microphone from my hand. "You had no right to record me. You're manipulating these people." Her voice was shrill now, desperate. "You can't just shut off water to families because you're upset about some dirt, I said quietly. But the microphone picked it up. "That dirt is my property. Would you like it if someone dug up your backyard without asking?" The color drained from Diane's face. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her hand went to her chest, then clutched the podium edge as her knees buckled. Someone in the front row stood up, a middle-aged woman. "I'm a nurse. Mrs. Pritchard, are you okay?" Diane shook her head, breathing fast and shallow. I need to sit down." Two men rushed forward to help her to a chair. Someone called out to dial 911. The room erupted into chaos. People standing, talking, shouting questions. I stepped back from the podium, gathered my documents, and walked toward the side exit. As I pushed through the door into the night, I heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. 3 days after the meeting, I sat across from Deputy Hayes and a woman in a gray suit at the county sheriff's office. The room was small with bare walls, a table between us, and a New Mexico flag in the corner. The woman introduced herself as Ellen Rodriguez from the state engineer office. Early 50s with dark hair pulled back and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we've reviewed your documentation. The HOA violated New Mexico Statute 72-1-1 regarding unauthorized water infrastructure on private land, and Statute 47-12-1 for trespass. We're issuing a fine of $12,000 to the Desert Springs HOA and requiring them to remediate within 30 days. I nodded slowly. "What about my land? What happens to the pipeline they installed?" Ellen opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "They have 2 options. Remove the pipeline entirely at their expense, or negotiate an easement agreement with you that includes fair compensation and legal documentation. If they choose neither, we revoke their water use permits, and they'll need to find an alternative source." Deputy Hayes leaned back in his chair. "For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, most of the community understands now. After that meeting, people started asking questions. Turns out Diane Pritchard pulled similar moves on 3 other properties in the past 2 years. Small landowners who couldn't afford to fight back. You're not the first. You're just the first who had the resources to push back." I thought about that. About the families who'd been quietly steamrolled, who'd accepted settlements that barely covered their losses because they didn't know the law or couldn't afford a lawyer. That same afternoon, Diane Pritchard resigned as HOA president. The announcement came through the community group. A brief post with no explanation, just a single line. "Due to personal health concerns and recent events, I am stepping down effective immediately." The comments were sparse, quieter than the firestorm from days before. A few people thanked her for her service. Most said nothing. By evening, the HOA had elected a new interim president, a retired civil engineer named Robert Hill, who I'd met once at a hardware store. He was 60-something, calm, methodical, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once. He called me that night. "Mr. Mercer, this is Robert Hill. I'm the new HOA president. I'd like to meet with you and discuss a resolution. Can we sit down tomorrow?" We met at the Martinez Law Office. Robert came alone with a yellow legal pad and a pen. He shook my hand firmly. "Mr. Mercer, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA. What happened to you was wrong. We violated your property rights knowingly, and that's unacceptable." I watched him carefully, looking for the angle, the hidden agenda. There wasn't one. His face was open, tired, sincere. "I've reviewed all the documents," he continued. "The email, the recordings, the county record. We owe you compensation and a formal easement agreement. I've spoken with our attorney, and we're prepared to offer you $15,000 for the unauthorized use of your land, plus a legally binding easement contract that pays you an annual fee of $2,000 for as long as the pipeline remains." I leaned forward. "And what about accountability? What happens to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else?" Robert nodded. "We're implementing new procedures. All property decisions now require a full board vote, transparency reports filed monthly, and any project affecting land outside HOA boundaries must have documented permission before work begins. We're also establishing a community oversight committee with rotating members to prevent any one person from having too much power." I thought about it for a long moment. About the 198 families who'd been without water. About the children and the elderly. About Diane collapsing on that stage. This was never about punishing them. It was about making them see. Do you have the agreement in writing? Robert slid a folder across the table. I read every word, every clause, every contingency. At the bottom of the final page was a signature line for both parties and a notary stamp. I pulled out my pen. There's one more thing, I said. I want a public statement from the HOA acknowledging what happened, posted in the community group and sent to every household. Not blaming anyone, just stating the facts. We trespassed, we violated property law, and we're making it right. Robert didn't hesitate. Done. We signed the papers in front of a notary who worked in the building, a woman who'd probably witnessed 100 land deals and never asked questions. When it was finished, Robert stood and offered his hand again. When will you restore the water? I already called Tom Bradley this morning, I said. The valve will be open by 6 p.m. Robert's shoulders sagged with visible relief. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. I drove home in the late afternoon light, the sky turning orange and pink above the Guadalupe Range. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Ben Carter's car parked near the fence. He was sitting on my porch steps with a white bakery box. I got out and walked over. What's this apple pie? Ben said. My wife made it. She said you earned it. I sat down next to him, and we opened the box. The smell of cinnamon rising in the desert air. So it's over? Ben asked. I nodded. They're paying compensation, signing an easement, and reforming their procedures. And the water goes back on tonight. Ben took a bite of pie and chewed thoughtfully. You know, a lot of people are talking, saying you did what needed to be done. Some are even grateful. I shrugged. I just wanted my property respected. The rest was just making sure they understood that. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun drop below the horizon. 2 months later, in early September, I sat on my porch in the late afternoon. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the west pasture, 30 head moving slowly through the dried grass. For the first time in months, I felt something close to contentment. Ben's car pulled up the driveway. He climbed the steps with a bakery box and settled into the chair next to mine. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then he spoke. You hear about the changes Robert Hill formed that oversight committee like he promised. They published their first transparency report last week. Every expenditure listed, every vote recorded, every contract made public. People are actually reading it. Some folks even showed up to the last board meeting just to observe. I took a sip of tea. That's how it should have been from the start. Ben nodded. Diane moved to Phoenix. By the way, living with her daughter. I heard she's not involved in any HOA business anymore. I thought about that. About a woman who'd wielded power carelessly and lost everything when it was turned against her. I don't hate her, I said quietly. I just hated what she did. How she treated people like they didn't matter. Ben looked at me with something like respect. You know, a lot of people thought you were the villain at first. But after that meeting, after they saw the evidence, things changed. There's a whole different conversation happening now in the community. People asking questions about other HOA decisions, requesting documentation, standing up when something doesn't seem right. You didn't just fight for your land, Jake. You showed them they could fight for theirs. I watched a family walking along the property line in the distance, a father and mother with 2 small children. The little boy saw me and waved. I waved back. That wasn't my goal, I said. I just wanted them to respect my property. But maybe sometimes standing up for yourself reminds other people they have that right too. Ben opened the bakery box and we shared the contents. Some kind of lemon cake his wife had made. The sky deepened from gold to rose to purple as we talked about inconsequential things. The weather, the upcoming school year, Ben's plans to do some volunteer work now that he had free time. Eventually he stood to leave. You need anything, you call me, he said. I will, I replied. After he drove away, I sat alone watching the last light fade from the sky. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the state engineer office. A formal closure notice. Case number SE-24 HOA-0739 regarding Desert Springs Estates HOA is now resolved. All violations remediated, fines paid, easement agreement filed with county records, no further action required. I read it twice, then closed my phone and set it on the porch railing. The house behind me was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I thought about my grandfather, who'd worked this land for 40 years, who'd taught me that in the desert you don't survive by taking from others, but by respecting what each person has earned. He'd never imagined his grandson would need to use water as leverage against a homeowners association. But I think he would have understood the principle. Property rights aren't just about land and fences. They're about dignity, about the fundamental idea that no one can take what's yours simply because they have power, and you seem powerless. I never set out to be a hero or to teach anyone a lesson. I just wanted what was mine, and I wanted the people who violated that to acknowledge it. Not through violence or revenge, but through the system, through evidence and law, and the patient work of proving I was right. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it worked. The HOA paid what they owed, changed how they operated, and 198 families learned that power unchecked always finds a limit eventually. The community was free now, not from rules or structure, but from the abuse of those things. And I was back to being what I'd always been, a rancher with 80 acres and a herd of cattle, and a belief that doing things the right way matters even when the easy way tempts you. Somewhere in the development, sprinklers were running, water arcing through the evening air. I knew that water was flowing legally now, through proper channels, with proper compensation, the way it should have been from the start. I turned off the porch light and listened to the sound of that water in the distance. Steady and legal. Tomorrow I'd fix fences. Tomorrow would be ordinary. That was all I'd ever wanted. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone first. Jake's story proves that dignity isn't given. It's defended with patience, evidence, and courage. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever faced someone who thought you wouldn't fight back, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in Jake's position. Share this with someone who needs to hear that property rights matter, that the little guy can win, and that justice doesn't require violence, just resolve. Subscribe to Gated Drama for more true stories of people who refused to back down when power tried to silence them. Your story might be next.